In 1956, Edmund Wilson published a scathing review of The Lord of the Rings, in which he described the story as being a simple confrontation of the forces of evil with the forces of good. And while I think that most people would disagree with many parts of that review, especially calling The Lord of the Rings juvenile trash, the idea that The Lord of the Rings is a simple good versus bad narrative has stuck. Haters say this as an insult, and fans use it as a compliment. And while yes, Tolkien certainly wasn't Joe Abercrombie, he wasn't trying to totally rewrite the paradigm of what good and evil are, I strongly disagree with anyone that would try and claim that Tolkien's vision of evil is simple. J.R.R. Tolkien was a man who was very familiar with just how bad the world could be. He had lived through both world wars, he'd fought in the first and watched his son fight in the second. He knew the bloodiness of human history, he had read the myths and the tales, and he had a very complex and nuanced understanding of the Christian perspective of evil. And in The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien takes all of these things and distills them into a vision of evil that is multifaceted, changeable, and remarkably real. Tolkien did indeed draw a very firm line in the sand between good and evil, but that doesn't mean that his perception of good and evil were simple. So in today's video, I want to make my argument that Tolkien wasn't just an excellent world builder, storyteller, or poet, he was an incredible philosopher, and there's a lot of good to be learned from his philosophy of evil. But if things like world building and writing are your jam, you should check out this video's sponsor, World Anvil. World Anvil is a world building, writing, and game mastering desktop software that can help support your creative work. With World Anvil, you can create wiki-like articles to help keep all your creativity in one organized place. You can link to other articles, create cross-references, everything that you need to world build like the best of them. World Anvil also allows you to design interactive maps, so that you can turn pre-existing maps into interactive pages so that you can explore your world like never before. Their Chronicles feature is one of my favorites because it allows you to plot events across time and space. World Anvil can support you as you plot your story, build your author platform, and publish. And if you're a gamer, either a player or a game master, World Anvil is the perfect tool to keep your games fresh and organized. From character sheets to family trees, to music to images, and so much more, World Anvil is the perfect place to hone your creativity. World Anvil is the ultimate world-building toolset and RPG campaign manager, and whether you're a writer, artist, gamer, player, or hobbyist, it's going to help take you to the next level. You can check them out at worldanvil.com, and be sure to use my code SHIRE to get 51% off any yearly subscription to World Anvil. Just go to worldanvil.com or use the link in my description to get started today. Thank you so much to World Anvil for supporting the channel, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors. I think that the clearest way to break into this dense philosophical concept is to examine the two different perspectives of evil that are in conflict and collaboration in Middle-earth. And the first is the idea of evil as a real material force. In this worldview, evil is its own separate entity that is actively at war with the good. And this is an idea that appears all throughout our mythic history. Equally matched gods of chaos and order battling it out, dark versus light, the spiritual versus the material. Even in the Bible, we can see imagery that seems to picture evil as an external, active force, particularly in the apocalyptic imagery of the Book of Revelation. And at a glance, this seems to be a concept well represented in Tolkien's works. The books are called The Lord of the Rings, and that lord is Sauron, who is literally a dark lord who embodies evil in Middle-earth. Throughout the story, we see his voice and the shadow of his presence as a constant danger, contrasted with the light and fire imagery of Galadriel, Gandalf, and all those on the side of good. Looking back through Tolkien's Legendarium, his earliest stories are shaped by this kind of conflict, the good Valar versus the Dark Lord Morgoth. In his essays on the subject, which are linked in the sources in the description below, Tom Shippey refers to this vision of evil as the Manichaean or dualist perspective. But this Manichaean dualist perspective is not the only one represented in The Lord of the Rings. When speaking on the nature of the Dark Lord Sauron, Elrond says that nothing was evil in the beginning. And according to this worldview, evil is not its own separate extant force, but it's rather just an absence of something. It is an absence of good. It's sort of like how cold is something that we call cold, but really, it is nothing in itself, it is just an absence of heat. The idea of evil as a privation of good was a concept first developed by classical philosophers, and then refined by St. Augustine of Hippo, and this was adopted as the primary Christian worldview of the Middle Ages, in part because it gave an answer to the problem of evil. How is it that a good God who created a good world could allow evil to exist? Well, this perspective explains, evil doesn't really exist in a material way, but free will grants that some people may turn away from the good, and that denial or perversion of good is what we see as evil. This is the Christian, and in Tolkien's case particularly the Catholic perspective of evil. God created the world to be good, and he created mankind to be good, and thus evil is just a corruption or perversion of that good. Evil in itself was not created. Frodo outlines this perspective when speaking of the orcs. The shadow that bred them can only mock. It cannot make, not real new things of its own. Tom Shippey refers to this as the Boethian perspective, named after Boethius, the Roman philosopher whose writings helped influence this idea for the medieval church, but it's also thought of as evil through privation. So here we have our two different angles, evil as a dualist conflict, and evil as the privation of good, or as I'll mostly call it from here out, Manichaean and Boethian. Now, these two ideas at first do not seem to get along. Manichaeism is literally considered a heresy by the Catholic Church, and the Boethian perspective of evil being a very personal experience seems to take some of the steam out of the dualist conflict between right and wrong. However, through some kind of Tolkienian magic, both of these ideas are able to find their footing in The Lord of the Rings, and the ring itself is a prime example of this. On an internal level, it acts as an addiction, amplifying the worst parts of its bearer, raising up the wicked voices over the good and preying on their weakness. But it also certainly acts as an external force. It is a hand pushing the user not just towards their own whims, but the overall whims of Sauron. It has its own will and desire, and no matter the person, unless you're Tom Bombadil, it will take your best intentions and turn them wicked. And because of this multi-pronged approach, the ring becomes a much more intimidating weapon than a weapon that simply utilized Manichaean or Boethian philosophies separately. As Tom Shippey puts it, if evil were just the absence of good, then the ring could never be more than a psychic amplifier, and all the characters would need to do would be to put it aside. Conversely, if evil were only an external force without echo in the hearts of the good, then someone might have to take it to Orodruin, but it would not need to be Frodo. The kind of evil found in the ring makes it quite clear that Tolkien was not willing to let either of these philosophies become the sole and dominant perspective in Middle-earth. He knew that evil was the corruption of good, and he saw the ways in which evil sometimes seemed a very real entity which must be defeated. And I think that he unites these visions of evil in a really unique way through the concept of shadow. Evil is described as a shadow again and again in Middle-earth, which is fascinating because what is a shadow? Is a shadow real? We can see it, we can feel the cold of it upon our skin, but a shadow is not anything. It is simply an absence of light. Shadows both are and are not. And so it would come to be with evil in Middle-earth. But it wasn't always so clear-cut, and as we move back through the timeline of Middle-earth to an age when myths were reality, we find that the shadows seem far more substantial. Morgoth is known as the Dark Lord of all Dark Lords, but he was not always this way. Before the Song of the Ainur, when creation as we know it was sung into being by the Ainur spirits that Iluvatar first created, Melkor, as he was known back in those days, was just as good at heart as anything else that Iluvatar had created. Tolkien says, "To Melkor among the Ainur had been given the greatest gifts of power and knowledge, and he had a share in all the gifts of his brethren. He had gone often alone into the void places, seeking the imperishable flame. For desire grew hot within him to bring into being things of his own, and it seemed to him that Iluvatar took no thought for the void, and he was impatient of its emptiness. Yet he found not the fire, for it is with Iluvatar." And I love this passage because it sets up Melkor's fall in terms of the kind of evil that we see in Middle-earth. Light versus the absence of light. Creation, and without the ability to create, your only option is corruption. Melkor, as one of Tolkien's many overpassionate creatives, is pushed by a desire to create as Iluvatar did. He does not want privation or manipulation of what already is. He wants the imperishable flame for himself. But this is not his lot. This is a fundamentally Boethian world, and Melkor's only creative outlet is to take the music of Iluvatar and twist it. By the end of the song, Melkor is singing his own music, but make no mistake, it is absolutely the breath of Iluvatar that filled his lungs in the first place. This limitation is what drives Melkor into corruption, and through the act of singing discontent and discord into the Song of the Ainur, Melkor wove this very particular kind of evil through every thread of creation itself. And while this creation story does a good job of setting up Tolkien to tell a story that aligns relatively well with the Catholic cosmogonical worldview, it differs in Middle-earth in some very significant ways. In real-world Catholicism, God created the world good, and this included mankind. Satan's fall introduced evil to the world, and he was able to tempt humans into evil, an option made possible by humanity's free will, but importantly, Satan's fall was not a part of the creative act itself. The creative act itself belonged to God alone, and he made the world good. But in Tolkien's world, Iluvatar used sub-creators. So while he had intended the world to be good, the will and the discord of his sub-creators meant that Melkor's fall was a part of the creative act of the world itself. Although the end result of this is more or less the same, that due to free will, evil was entered into the world, Tolkien explains, "The fall or corruption, therefore, of all things in Middle-earth and all inhabitants of it was a possibility, if not inevitable." Morgoth's unfulfilled desire to create originally, and his abuse of the music's original good, is a thing that carries out through all of time and space, and something that rings in every rational soul. Thus, Tolkien has forever colored the tone and the sheer inexorability of evil in his world. As he says, evil and this fall from grace is not just a possibility, but for many, an inevitability. And this fall stems from a dissatisfaction with the fact that none can truly create aside from Iluvatar. It stems from the fact that Melkor was trapped in a fundamentally Boethian world. And perhaps as a result of this discontent, Morgoth would appear as a very Manichaean, dualist presence in the earliest days of the Legendarium. The Valar represent good and light. Morgoth and the souls that he was able to twist away from heaven represent everything evil. Morgoth burns and shatters the land of Arda, while the Valar remold it into good. This cosmic conflict persists through all of the early tales. These first battles are primal expressions of good versus evil. Through the very specific type and origin of villainy that Tolkien has fostered in Morgoth, he shows that it is possible to capture and embrace this very fundamental, apocalyptic human instinct on how to portray evil while still maintaining his perspective of evil. But this very clear vision of evil becomes a little bit more blurry when we take into account the other monsters of the early legendarium, especially Ungoliant. Ungoliant has no clear backstory like Morgoth. The elves don't know of her origin, although it's supposed that she one day descended from the darkness surrounding the world, and that she was one of the early beings corrupted to Morgoth's servitude. Either way, she presents a fascinating ontological problem, because as we've explored, everything began good, but did Ungoliant really? Where is the good within her? There's nothing in Ungoliant that even seems like it may have been a warp of the good. She is purely monstrous, driven by nothing but hunger, lust, and instinct. Tolkien describes that she sucked up all the light that she could find and spun it forth again in dark nets of strangling gloom, until no light more could come to her abode, and she was famished. We've already discussed shadow and how intangible it is, how important it is to Tolkien's entire argument that it is not real, and yet Ungoliant is described as weaving with it. In her hands, the dark becomes something that is capable of blocking the light. How can this be? Certainly, she had to devour light in order to create this darkness, but I think that ideas like this mark out Ungoliant as a unique manifestation of evil. I think that she can fit into this Boethian worldview if we're willing to admit that she is not fully a rational being. Through Tolkien's worldview, evil can really only exist for rational beings. Beings that speak, beings that think, and beings that have free will. A human having free will that makes the choice to kill his neighbor has done something evil, because he was capable of knowing what the good was and capable of choosing otherwise. However, if an insect kills another insect, that is not an act of evil because the insect is not a rational being. They had no view of good and thus could not have willingly committed evil. Animals, of course, do make choices. There are things like instinct, there are things like empathy, and they do things which may seem like a good, but without the rational ability to know what good is, they are incapable of the kind of evil that a rational being is capable of. Now, Ungoliant sits in a really interesting place in this conversation, because it's kind of hard to say exactly how rational she is. We don't know her origin story, we don't even really know what she is. The text does say that Morgoth maybe corrupted her, which implies that at one point she had a state of being that was not in the evil corrupted state that she is now, and she does talk a couple of times, but the text is very sparse when it comes to her actual motivations. It seems like, for the most part, she is a creature driven entirely by animal instinct. Her evil is not motivated with the same kind of complex thought that we see in Morgoth. Instead, she's driven by desperation, hunger, and lust. She doesn't make plans for evil. She can only go along with the schemes of someone with more rationality, like Morgoth. So if Ungoliant is even rational at all, I think it's fair to say she's operating on a lower level of rationality somehow. And her descendant Sheilob is proof of this, because while Ungoliant was possibly corrupted and she talked, Sheilob is much more of a purely monstrous being. Tolkien describes her. Her lust was not Sauron's lust. Little she knew or cared for towers or rings or anything devised by mind or hand, who only desired death for all others, mind and body, and for herself a glut of life. alone, swollen till the mountains could no longer hold her up, and the darkness could not contain her. That does not sound like a very rational being to me. Their origins aside, I think that Ungoliant and Sheilob stand as very real, monstrous, almost dualist creatures. If there was ever to be a material representation of sheer evil in Middle-earth, devoid entirely of good origin, these spiders would be that. But Tolkien avoids having these monsters shatter his Boethian worldview by both making these characters relatively ambiguous, but also making them, in the grand scheme of things, very powerless. Ungoliant and Sheilob both act as threats on an individual level, and if they're weaponized by someone else, they can cause quite a bit of harm, but because they have no ability to scheme or to rationalize, their power is incredibly limited. They pose no real threat to the overall good of the world. Ungoliant, and thus also Sheilob, I think, stand as proof that although Tolkien did believe that evil was the privation of good, he could also find room in his worldview to admit that there were things that looked like truly terrible, primal manifestations of evil itself. But it is worth noting that Ungoliant is a relic of the Elder Days, and something that Tolkien does masterfully in the Silmarillion and into The Lord of the Rings is show how this kind of legendary, Manichaean, dualist view of evil can transition into a more Boethian and more grounded approach to evil in the events of The Lord of the Rings. And the best character to demonstrate this is Sauron. Sauron is in so many ways a carbon copy of Morgoth, except that he is very clearly a product of the later age that he lives in. Morgoth had his eye fixed upon all of creation. He had decided that since he could not create, he would destroy everything. He is the denied maker that becomes an unmaker. Sauron, meanwhile, has his eyes set on a less cosmically intimidating goal. A goal that Tolkien makes clear was not even evil at first. Once upon a time, Sauron began with fair motives, motives of reorganization and rehabilitation. Sauron was not just created good, he had originally aimed for good. But this good that he sought is unfortunately one that can very quickly turn into evil when things like ego become involved. A wish for leadership becomes a need for control. Control becomes power. This desire for power becomes a desire for absolute power, and absolute power, very famously, corrupts absolutely. Sauron's weakness was not the catastrophic, legendary fall of his master Morgoth, but rather a very human stumbling from good intentions into evil outcomes. And the mere fact that this can happen, that good intentions so often are led astray, is, Tolkien believed, a symptom of a fallen world, a world where evil is a possibility. And Tolkien believed that the pitfalls that Sauron fell into were also a pitfall for each and every one of us. He says of these kinds of evildoers in the Legendarium, "I should regard them as no more wicked or foolish, but in much the same peril, as Catholics engaged in certain kinds of physical research, for example, those producing, if only as a byproduct, poisonous gases and explosives. Things not necessarily evil, but which, things being as they are, and the nature and motives of the economic masters who provide all the means for their work being as they are pretty certain to serve evil ends. It is through understated and insidious evil that atrocities become possible. And we see an interesting transfer of Sauron's character from a very cosmic kind of evil in the Silmarillion, or at least a more Manichaean form of evil, to a much more stripped back and Boethian kind of evil in The Lord of the Rings. Evil that results from small stumbles rather than catastrophic falls. The winds of time seem to strip the power and the form away from Sauron until he's nothing more than a shadow ensconced in a tower, desperately grappling for power in a world in which he no longer belongs. He is still a very real threat, and one that must be challenged as Morgoth was of old, but the forms of evil are changing in Middle-earth. There is no longer room for the reality of the mythic dimension. Evil has turned from a grand cosmological conflict into petty, painful, and mundane discomforts. Through the ring, we can see how Sauron's power is a real threat, and it's something that must be destroyed, and while the external battle is a very real one that these characters that are bearing the ring face, the real danger always seems to come from the inside. Sauron's power as a Manichaean villain is reducing, and the Boethian danger is becoming all the more strong. Another tragically human dimension of evil explored in Middle-earth is Tolkien's orcs. And these orcs are something that changed considerably and very tellingly through Tolkien's writing process. In The Hobbit, orcs and goblins were relatively flat, villainous minions. They were storybook monsters. And in his original conception of them, this worked because they had been created by Morgoth as pawns of evil. But as Tolkien worked the kinks out of the philosophy of Middle-earth, he realized that this was impossible. Morgoth could not create beings that were solely evil. And so, in later iterations of the mythology, he changed his perspective to be that orcs had once been good, rational creatures that were twisted by Morgoth and corrupted into what they are in the events of the story. And this presents a whole new slew of problems, because if orcs were not created evil, that means that they were created good. That means they were good at one point and were made evil, and thus it means that theoretically they could be redeemed again. And this isn't just me guessing or theorizing. Tolkien said explicitly in his letters that the orcs were rational creatures, and all rational creatures were created good. And what's really sad is that even in the text of The Lord of the Rings, we can see that the orcs do hold onto some semblance of good. However twisted, they do have their own sense of morality. When the orcs find Frodo abandoned by Sam after he thinks that he was killed by Shelob, the orc Gorbag accuses Sam of being part of a nasty elvish trick. The orcs clearly believe that leaving one's friend behind to die is a wrong thing to do. It is nasty. The orcs have senses of humor, they sing together, they speak of helping each other, and it seems like they do have some kind of clan or group loyalty towards each other. In one conversation, Sam asks if the orcs just drink and eat poison, and Frodo explains that they can't, that they still need real food and drink to consume. And in that same way, the orcs are incapable of completely foregoing the idea of morality. Their sense of morality may be twisted, but they can no more ignore the real good than they can drink poison. However warped it is, they still think in terms of right and wrong. They still have good and evil, and they're still people. So how is it that people go this bad? Tom Shippey proposes that this can be attributed to very simple, very human, small-mindedness and selfishness. The orcs are the kind of people who do technically know right from wrong. They would just rather look after themselves and stay at home than actually go out and commit to doing it. This kind of evil is very small stakes. It's not apocalyptic. It doesn't even require you to completely abandon your moral code. But when you have a bunch of people all thinking like this, when you have, say, an army of people that are all looking after their own self-interest over the good, really terrible things can happen. An army of senselessly irrational evil foot soldiers is a terrifying prospect. But I think what's even more terrifying is the idea that that army coming against you is each made up of real people. In his novel Jingo, I think Terry Pratchett put it best. It was much better to imagine men in some smoky room somewhere, made mad and cynical by privilege and power, plotting over brandy. You had to cling to this sort of image, because if you didn't, then you might have to face the fact that bad things happened because ordinary people, the kind who brushed the dog and told the children bedtime stories, were capable of then going out and doing horrible things to other ordinary people. It was so much easier to blame it on them. It was bleakly depressing to think that they were us. If it was them, then nothing was anyone's fault. If it was us, then what did that make me? After all, I'm one of us. The situation of the orcs is a really uncomfortable, close look at how evil can actually come to be in our real world today. And I think that this is one of the most important things that The Lord of the Rings does. It tempts us in with these huge cosmological displays of grand evil which must be battled against with swords and shields, and it shows us how that exact same kind of evil becomes the small, petty, invisible evil that is no less harmful that we see in the world today. In Middle-earth, evil cannot cease to be. Tolkien believed that until Judgment Day, people would still have free will, and thus people would always sometimes choose to go away from good and thus to evil. However, evil can sometimes change forms. And even at the end of The Lord of the Rings, when Sauron has been defeated, evil has not perished. It's simply taken on a new form. And we can see this clearly in the Shire. The hobbits return to the Shire under the misconception that their tiny parochial world could never really be affected by the great workings of evil that they've just confronted. But they're wrong. Evil has made it to the Shire. It has just adapted to suit the new environment. Saruman has fallen from his place of might and power and become a petty, conniving villain. Once a wizard, a powerful Maiar spirit, Saruman has allowed time and evil to degrade him into a remarkably human storybook villain. His companion Wormtongue is also a crude imitation of what evil once was. Back in the day, they knew how to have an evil court advisor. Sauron had slipped into the courts of the Númenóreans and seduced their god-granted kingdom out from under them. Meanwhile, Wormtongue is barely able to pull the wool over the eyes of a battered old man. Saruman and Wormtongue bring this shallow, degraded form of evil to the Shire, where they prove that, although degraded, it is no less potent. Their evil is exactly the kind of evil that is effective against the people of the Shire. They use suspicion and fear of the other to turn the community against itself, manipulating their laziness to force harmful industrialization upon them. And this evil, while much less intimidating and terrifying than the mythic stuff, is no less evil, and it requires the hobbits to come back from their world-saving venture just to rout this kind of evil from the Shire. They have faced the Dark Lord Sauron himself, and even then, they are barely equipped to drive away the kind of evil that Saruman and Wormtongue have brought into their home. They needed to learn the lessons on the big scale to be able to deal with something that seems smaller scale, but is just as harmful. More and more, as the Age of Myth passes into the Age of Men, the shape of evil is changing. And that means that the way that that evil is defeated must also change. The structure of Tolkien's mythos is entirely crafted to funnel us all into that same point. Because the reality is that evil was probably never this grand, dualist thing that we look back and imagine that it was. Evil was always this petty and Boethian thing, this thing that's much harder to rout out or to face. But Tolkien understood that we were able to learn a lot from these stories in which evil is so clearly represented and so clearly fought. There is power to be gained from these stories that can then be translated into facing the kind of evil that we face in our everyday lives. And in the fantasy world of Middle-earth, Tolkien was able to make real the vision of evil that he knew to be real, and the vision of evil as he usefully perceived it. And yet, this commingled philosophy is far from perfect, and I think that the orcs are the clearest proof of this. As we discussed, they represent a very human kind of evil. The kind of evil that we all want to hope could be repented from, and yet, the characters that we're supposed to see as heroes slaughter them en masse. The main message of this story is pity and mercy, and we see how, with characters like Gollum, who are wretched and reprehensible, that it was the right thing to do to show him mercy. So how is it that that same mercy can't be extended to Gorbag and Shagrat, who are, at least as Tolkien says, just as rational and forgivable creatures as Gollum? So how can we call The Lord of the Rings an apt depiction of good and evil? How can we say that this is a just world that Tolkien wrote when double standards like this are allowed to exist? Well, I think we can't. I think that there were certain parts of the human experience and certain problems of evil that Tolkien translated into his world that he just did not have a solution for. Tolkien had been in the First World War. He had fought in the Battle of the Somme. He had seen death all around him and been a part of bringing that death to others. He knew all too well what war did to a person, how this very necessary us versus them mentality could make other rational human beings into orcs. And that doesn't make it right, that doesn't make it just, but according to Tolkien, there were still wars that needed to be fought. You still needed to defend the good, even if it meant that in some ways you were giving in to evil. There was a brutal, uncomfortable, and unsolvable tension between these realities, and Tolkien attributed it to the fact that we live in a fallen world. Ursula K. Le Guin once observed, "Those who fault Tolkien on the problem of evil are usually those who have an answer to the problem of evil, which he did not." There is complication, and there is push and pull there, and say what you will about Tolkien's vision of evil, I think it is simply inaccurate to say that it is an exactly traditional view of evil, that he pulled all of his perceptions of evil from the old stories. The idea that power is an inherently corrupting force is actually a pretty contemporary one. According to Tom Shippey, it first entered the public imagination in the late 19th century and was made much more popular and well accepted by the pain and loss of the two world wars in the 20th century. And it's not that power hadn't always had a corrupting effect, but the scale of power that was possible in the 20th century was just so far and above anything that was possible in the past. It's only until someone is able to achieve the power of a god that you realize that no one but God should have that power. Suddenly it was possible to cause mass death and destruction with a simple push of a button. We had global communication, we could see people and talk to people and hear people from across the world, and it seemed like all that did was make us hate each other more. Many writers of the 20th century, including Tolkien, wrestle with this new problem of evil in their works, and while none of them come to conclusions, obviously, many of them, such as Tolkien, were able to begin inventing new ways to stride forward. A new model of courage was needed to face this new kind of evil, and for Tolkien, this came in the form of hobbits. Hobbits knew all too well that they were not capable of outmuscling the Dark Lord, but because that was never their goal, they were able to keep their spirits. Frodo didn't leave on his journey with the goal of saving the world, he left with the aim of saving the Shire. Sam never would have made it to Mount Doom if he didn't have his eyes firmly on his best friend and trying to save him. Merry and Pippin became great warriors, not because they were determined to make their name in the history books, but because they wanted to keep their friends safe. Before the last battle, Gandalf observes, "It is not our part to master all the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succor of those years wherein we are set. uprooting the evil in the fields that we know, so that those who live after may have clean earth to till. What weather they shall have is not ours to rule. The thing that makes hobbits so important, so remarkable in their bravery, so necessary in the quest to defeat evil, is that they understand what Gandalf was saying there. They understand their own limitations. That's the thing that makes them so hardy. They set their eyes on small goals, goals that are achievable, and goals that will take them just one small step closer to the greater good for which they strive. If you put down your dishes or your laundry or whatever else you're doing while this video plays, and you stride out into the world looking for world peace, you're gonna be sorely disappointed. So maybe you just need to think a little more like a hobbit. Set your sights a little smaller. Try and find peace with yourself, with your family, with your neighbors, with strangers. Because sometimes setting your sights small, doing the small tasks like, say, carrying a ring to a volcano, can lead to the greatest of victories. When you sit back and look at the sum total of evil that exists in the world, things start to look hopeless really fast. When power is in the hands of people that only want more power, when the Shire is burning and families are being torn apart, when it seems like there is nothing but hatred everywhere you look, it's very hard to feel like anything that you can do on an individual level could matter. And I don't really know what to do in the face of that, except to hang on to the hope that we are rational people, that we do all want good, and that this shadow will someday pass. And I really hope that, as Sam says, once this shadow passes and the sun shines, it'll shine out all the clearer. I don't have all the answers, you probably don't, but hey, at least Tolkien didn't either. When his son was serving in the Second World War, he wrote to him, describing the whole business of war as an ultimately evil job. For we are attempting to conquer Sauron with the ring. But the penalty is, as you know, to breed new Saurons and slowly turn men and elves into orcs. Not that in real life things are as clear-cut as in a story, and we started out with a great many orcs on our side. Well, there you are, a hobbit amongst the Uruk-hai. Keep up your hobbitry in heart, and think that all stories feel like that when you are in them. You are inside a very great story. Through The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien shows how we must look to the past in order to discover how to deal with evil and how to deal with good. We can never forget the people that we were and the way that we were, but we also must continue to move forward. We must keep listening, we must keep learning, and we must be willing to change. But perhaps more importantly, we can't forget that no matter how much evil there is, no matter how dark and tall that shadow looms, there is some good in this world, and it's worth fighting for. I need the record to show that I rarely, if ever, intend for these videos to go from being philosophical literary discussions into highly personalized therapy appointments about the state of the world, but I figure that if you didn't click away when I started pulling out the word Boethian and Manichaean, you probably don't mind that kind of thing, so thanks for sticking around. But anyway, do be sure to leave your thoughts on this topic in the comments. This is a really philosophical and theologically dense idea, and I am neither a philosopher nor a theologian, but I know that some of you are, so feel free to explore the niches that I didn't, or offer nuance on the points that I made in this video. As always, if this topic interests you, there's a ton more good reading in the sources, which are linked in my description. I will highlight or bold a couple of my favorites. Tom Shippey is a really authoritative voice on this subject, especially the stuff about orcs. He really gets into it, and it's fascinating, so go ahead and check that out if you want to learn more. Go ahead and give this video a like if you enjoyed it, because that really helps me out, and share it with someone who you think is evil, I guess? Maybe don't do that. Maybe just share it with a friend. That works too. Whatever. Share it with someone because that really helps me out as well. And do consider subscribing if you want to tune in every other week to hear me talk about The Lord of the Rings, the art of storytelling, and the other stuff that I like to talk about. Thank you so much for joining me this week and every week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.